It mentioned Chofetz Chaim in his introduction that in eight locations, the Torah speaks about emulating God within the context of doing Chesed. And ultimately, it concludes L'tovloch. And if you do this, it'll be good for you. So he explains that based on the degree of involvement in doing this kindness, that will determine what degree you'll be beneficiary of the goodness of God. And God's unleashing the blessing to the world and to the person is determined to how much chesed he does himself. Everything we find is measure for measure. You do chesed on a qualitative level, God will, in multiples, allow you to be the beneficiary of that chesed that you've done. You do it to a lesser degree, God will do it to a lesser degree. Meaning God's relationship with existence and the person is a mirror image of the way the person himself actualizes this area of chesed. Okay, this is the understanding. It's not citing a Gemara here. There's a Gemara in Sukkah, the tractate Sukkah, that when one does charity, the value of the charity is based on how you give the charity. For instance, a person is in need and you give it to him where you don't embarrass him. That chesed has greater value. What about if you give a person charity or help, financial assistance before he falls financially? You don't wait for a person to go into bankruptcy. And as the Talmud tells us, if you have an animal that's loaded up and it's faltering, if you assist the owner of that animal to rearrange, to reposition the cargo, the animal's not to collapse under the cargo. But once it falls to the ground, to be able to lift the animal, it's much more difficult. People very often, to wait for a person to collapse financially and be devastated, then you come to the rescue. But if you knew all along things were percolating and things were not good, why don't you come to his assistance earlier? Why only you wait for to only have this extreme level of issue, financial issue? Now you come. So that how you do the chesed, that the person should be a greater beneficiary. It could be the same amount of money. How you give it, that you take the person into consideration. You give it early enough to prevent very serious financial consequences. So based on all that, that will determine your level of worthiness and reward. You're giving the same amount of money, but it's how you give the money. We say Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. Torah itself is the ultimate mitzvah. We find in regard to atonement that if a person does chesed, he's more easily atoned. For instance, the Talmud in Tractate Baruch cites a pasuk, "B'chesed ve'emes yechuper ovel." It's a verse in Prophets. Through doing acts of kindness and truth, the sin will be atoned. The person will be rehabilitated. Torah itself is emes, that's unadulterated truth. But when you do chesed also, that assists in the process or expedites the process that you deserve to be atoned. I'll give you an example. Person comes before the judge and he could get a lenient sentence, he could get a harsh sentence, or he could be let off. And even give an opportunity to prevent it from happening again. It's in the judge's hands. And very often, what is it based upon? on the record of the defendant. If the record of the defendant is something, he's helpful to others. And this one time, somehow he did the wrong thing. The judge understands that the person basically is a good person. People make mistakes. That will engender a more lenient verdict than if the man never helped others, never did any acts of kindness to anyone else. He'll be seen by the judge as a predator. But if he does acts of kindness and helps others, and this one time he does the wrong thing, despite that, the judge will be merciful. So when everyone goes into judgment, nobody's perfect. And we want to be reinstated. The reinstatement means you have a relation with God. Who does God want to have a relationship with? You failed. You need atonement, which is reinstatement. The Chesed ve'emes yuchu parovim. By doing acts of kindness and engaging in Torah study, which is emes, which is truth, you'll be reinstated. Give you an example. A person studies and he's proficient in Torah, but he doesn't go out of his way to help others. As much as he engages in Torah study, but factually there's something missing. If in fact a Jew has an obligation to love his brother as he loves himself, and you have the ability to assist someone else, why aren't you assisting him? I'm preoccupied. I'm too busy. You want to know? For yourself, you're never too busy. But for others, you're busy. That clearly indicates that there's a level of failing here. And therefore, even though you have Torah, you're not going to be fully reinstated. You're not going to have atonement. Because you're not on God's so-called good guys list. But if you have Torah and you go and you're concerned for others, you do Chesed and you help others, then you're projecting a different image. It's not only you engaging in truth, but as a Jew, you're concerned for other people's predicaments and their situations. And when you're concerned for others, God sees you in a different light. He doesn't live for himself. He lives for others, not only for himself. So my understanding is this. We're a Jewish people. What's the difference between a community and individuals? If you have individuals living in a city, they have nothing to do with one another. They have no common bond. What are those people? The individuals happen to live in proximity of one another. What's what we call a tzibur? Tzibur is a community. The word tzibur means, savur means the gather. There's a cohesiveness. There's an interactive dynamic between them that concerns with one another. That dynamic means these people are one entity. Even though the entity is made up of individuals, but each individual, his value is the other person. Because he doesn't live for himself, he's concerned for the other person. And we have common goals, we have common interests. And what's good for one is good for everyone. And that's the perspective of the people. A person that's chesed, he's not only interested in himself, he's interested in others. God looks at that person not as an individual. As an individual, your record is what stands in your stead. But when you do chesed, it's not only your record stands in your stead. Others, because they're in need of your kindness, your value extends beyond yourself. As a result of that, studying Torah has a limitation, because that's you. When you do chesed, there are others. So there you're going beyond yourself. When you go beyond yourself, you take on another value. That's the chesed. That's doing Chesed. He cites a Gemara. Eli was the high priest in Mishkan Shiloh. This before the Beis Hamikdash was built, the temple was built. And this time of Samuel the prophet. Eli had two sons. They didn't behave properly. And because Eli's two sons, one's name was Chophni and the other one's name was Pinchas, they didn't behave. God says that the children of Eli will not live beyond the age of 20 years old. Although normally, when one brings a sacrifice, it atones for the person to allow the person to extend his life. But Eli's children and the descendants of his children will not live beyond 20 years old. And even if they bring sacrifices, they will not be atoned for their sin. That means all their descendants are going to pass away at a very premature young age. The two of the greatest rabbis of the Talmud were descendants of Eli's children. One of the people name was Abaye and Rava. Abaye and Rava, these two individuals, many of the arguments in the Talmud are between Abaye and Rava. They are the elucidators of the Mishnah. And they were both descendants of Eli's children. So the verse says, with sacrifices you will not be atoned. But the inference is, but with Torah and Gemilas Chasodim and acts of loving kindness, you will be atoned. So the Gemara tells us, Rava, the great Rava, great holy rabbi, disseminator of Torah, he lived until the age of 40. He should have passed away at the age of 20. But because he had such an outstanding record of Torah, God extended his life to 40. Abaye, who was related to him, who wasn't as great in Torah as Rava, he lived till the age of 60. Why did Abaye live till 60 and Rava only lived till 40? Because Rava's outstanding feature was Torah itself, was emes. But although he did Chesed, he wasn't as exemplary in Chesed as he was in Torah. Abaye, because not only did he have emes, he was exemplary in Torah, he was outstanding in Gemilas Chasodim, in acts of loving kindness. So because he excelled so exceptionally in Gemilas Chasodim, therefore his life was extended an additional 20 years. And he passed away at the age of 60. He cites an Ahavas Reb Nosson. This was a work written by a Tana. This is from the Mishnaic period. And he tells a story that this was after the destruction of the Second Temple. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the prince of the Jewish people. He was a student of Hillel, and they were leaving Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim was in ruins. This was after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. He was leaving Yerushalayim, and Rabbi Yeshua was walking behind him, and he saw the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, in ruins. So Rabbi Yeshua says to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, "Woe to us, the location where we would at one time atone for our sins no longer exists. We're bereft. What are we going to do?" So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai answered him, and he said, "B'ni al yeralach, my child." Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was great. He says to Rabbi Yeshua, "My child, don't be bereft. Don't feel it's hopeless. We have an atonement, which is the equivalent of the korban, of the sacrifice. We have something which is the equivalent of that if we do gemilas chesed, we do acts of loving kindness, we're able to achieve the same thing as the korban, as the sacrifice. As it says in the Pasuk, very interesting Pasuk, Ki chesed chafasti v'lo zevach. I want your chesed, I'm not interested in your sacrifice. Yeah? I want your zevach, I want your chesed, I'm not interested in your zevach. Now, it's very interesting. The second temple was destroyed because of what? Sinas chinam, unwarranted hate. So there's unwarranted hate. There was a lot of Torah during the second temple period, but there's a breakdown in relationships among Jews themselves. That's unwarranted hate. And people justified taking on positions which were unjustified, and they were opposed, and they believed they were doing it for the sake of God. But God knows better that they were rooted in this unwarranted hate between one another. So if a person is in this state of mind, that it's me and not you, and that's the base of unwarranted hate, and you want to bring the sacrifice, God says, you know something, if my children are not united, I'm not interested in your sacrifice. To prove it, the temple's going to be destroyed, and you're not going to be able to bring sacrifices. The only thing that I value is I want to see chesed. What is chesed? Chesed is addressing why the temple was destroyed. Therefore, the Navi says, the Pasuk says, Ki chesed chafatzti v'lo zevach. What I want is chesed. I don't want this sacrifice. Just tell you a personal story. You know, when I was a young child, my father, Olav Shalom, I must have been 5 years old, 6 years old. And I was at school already, and he would go daven early in the morning, and he would take me very often to the shul, where he would daven. We'd leave the house, it was still dark. I was only 5. And he would wake me up, I'd get dressed, and I would go to him to shul. It was a 5-minute car ride to the shul. And this is the old-time shuls on the Lower East Side. The shul must have been built in 1860. And the average age of many of the people there were in those years, in their 80s. That means these people were born who are in their 80s or close to 90, in the 50s. So when were they born? In Europe. They were all Europeans, all Lithuanian, from Lithuania and Russia, those kinds of European Jews. And in the 50s, there were many people, Jews, who were literally homeless. They had nowhere to sleep. They didn't have much to eat. So they would very often come to the shul, sit on the back table. There were tables, and they'd fall asleep on the table. And in the morning, very often, they would serve cake and schnapps and whiskey, and they'd have something to eat. And if there was a little more elaborate kiddush, they'd have some herring. And these people, they had nothing. They were very poor people. Many of them were widowers. They never were married. They were maybe Holocaust survivors. It was a pitiful group. And very often, during davening, they would fall asleep and their heads would be on the table, sleeping. And, you know, when you come to a certain part of the davening, like Kedusha, everybody's supposed to stand and respond. And there was one Jew there that was saying Kedusha, and he starts banging on the table and screaming. Kedusha, that they should get up and stand up and say Kedusha. These people haven't slept in a bed in who knows how long. These people have nothing. He was pounding on the table to such a degree, their heads were bouncing on the table from the vibration of his banging on the table. My father sees this. He becomes livid. And he says to the man, instead of screaming Kedusha, you should take some money out of your pocket and buy them some food to eat. Instead of being concerned about Kedusha, what about their just basic needs for food? Understand? How could you watch these people have nothing and you're more concerned about the Kedusha and what they have nothing to eat? God says, I'm not interested in your sacrifice. Chesed chafatzti, I want to see what kind of chesed you do. I'm not interested in your sacrifice. Because if the sacrifice, you live with the sacrifice, what about your fellow Jew? God says, I'm not interested. That clearly says you have no love for him, you have no concern for him. Know something? They're my children like you're my child. If that's the case, you're not concerned for them, I'm not concerned for you. So don't bring me a sacrifice. So therefore, although, that's what Shimon Yochai said to Rabbi Yeshua, although the temple is destroyed, we're not bereft. Because God says, Chesed chafatzti v'lo zebach. I'm interested in the chesed. You don't have to bring me the sacrifice, the korban. The Mishnah tells us that at the end of time, before Mashiach comes, we're going to have birth pangs of Mashiach. Just as a woman, when the child's about to be born, a woman has contractions. What's the value of a contraction? Because as the uterus contracts and the womb contracts, that's how the baby's pushed out of the womb, through the contractions. That's the movement. But factually, when a woman has contractions, there's tremendous pain. And as the child's about to be born, the pain climaxes, becomes more painful. And finally, when the child comes out, the mother no longer has pain. That's the birth process. Chesed Moshiach, before Mashiach comes, he's coming because it's the end of the road. We're ready for real time. God gave us every chance to make choices. We have debt to pay. Before Mashiach comes, we have debt. If you have debt to pay, things become very, very difficult for the Jewish people. Whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's rampant inflation, and there are many other problems. Those are the birth pangs of Mashiach. As Mashiach is coming, is being pushed into reality, into existence, we got to pay off the mortgage. You know, before you burn the mortgage, you make an extra effort to raise the money because you want to make that last payment. As painful it is, you want to pay that last payment. You pay it, you're relieved. Before Mashiach comes, there's very serious payments have to be paid. Because once we're ready for prime time, we have to be debt-free. That's Chesed Mashiach. The birth pangs of Mashiach. So they asked Rebbe Lezer, who was one of the members of the Mishnaic period, what does one do to be saved from Chesed Mashiach? What should you do? So he told his students, what should you do? Yasuk b'Torah gemilas hasodim. You should study Torah and engage in acts of loving kindness. And if you do that, you'll be protected. Otherwise, you're exposed. You know, it's interesting. Person goes into a certain area, he has to have battle gear to protect himself, whether it's a bulletproof vest or certain types of battle gear which protects you from injury, lacerations, whatever it is. What is the protective gear to protect you from that? The birth pangs of Mashiach, which things can become very painful and very difficult. He tells them you should engage in Torah study and acts of loving kindness. That will create this insular protection that you should not be vulnerable for what everybody else would be vulnerable for. But what's the concept? As we said, the prophet says, "Chesed ve'emes yuchu parovim." Through doing acts of loving kindness and study Torah, the sin will be atoned. The debt that we have to pay, what's that debt rooted in? It's rooted in sin. We have to make the last payments. We needed atonement. But if you engage in Gemilas Chesed and you study Torah, that itself allows you, that's the payment of the debt. God vows you're in the good guy column. And once you're in the positive column, that evokes a level of mercy that Hashem says, you know something, I'll waive it. I'll waive it. It's not necessary. And therefore, that creates that level of protection. You know, there was a king, he was a very evil man. His name was Ahab. During his period of time, he purged the prophets. He was time of Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet. And he killed most of the prophets of God. He was an idolater. And his prophets were called the prophets of Baal. And there was a person who was a courtier in this court. His name was Obadiah Hanavi, Obadiah, the prophet, where Ahav didn't realize that he himself was a prophet. And he went and he gathered 100 prophets together because he realized if he doesn't send them into hiding, they're going to be killed. And he found 2 locations of refuge for them, 2 caves. He took 50 of them, put them in one cave, and 50 of them put them in another cave. And that's why ultimately prophecy continued. Because if he wouldn't have, all the prophets would have been killed, and prophecy, the era of prophecy would have come to an end. This is the story. Achav was a bad man, as I'm just showing you. Even though Achav, as bad as he was, when it came to feeding his brothers, Jews, his level of hospitality was legendary. Okay? His doors were wide open to feed the poor, to feed anybody who was in need. He would treat you royally when it came to providing the basic amenities of life for Jews. And he had altars that they would sacrifice for idolatry on his royal grounds. And there was a Beis Hamikdash. There was a temple. The smoke of the altar of the idolatry, this would intermingle with the smoke that was rising off the temple altar. Could you imagine what's going on over here? It's a disgrace. The smoke billows up from the altar of the Mizbeach. That sacrifice is being brought for God. And simultaneously, he's sacrificing for idolatry on this other altar. As the smoke rises, it intermingles in midair. The angels come to God and they say, you know something? We're going to take this guy out. What he's doing is disgraceful. The smoke of idolatry, which is a denial of God's presence, omnipotence, is intermingled with the holy smoke that comes from the sacrifices of the temple. Allow us to take him out. Of course, it's a desecration of your name. God says no. Since he does chesed at this unusual level, this act of kindness, which is legendary, that chesed will protect him. He's a bad guy. But that we should unleash the attribute of justice, that he should be destroyed now, the chesed will protect him. It's the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin. And God will not allow the angels to react to his behavior and to destroy him. Does he have Gehenna? Is he going to go to spiritual hell because he was an evil man? Yes. Because he killed prophets? Yes. All that is correct. But in terms of putting things in abeyance, that he shouldn't be reprimanded or prosecuted, Chesed will protect him. It's very interesting. The United States of America was known among Jews, and even in the world, as Medina Shel Chesed. It's a country which is one of a kind when it comes to doing acts of loving kindness. There's no place in the world, a government that's concerned for the welfare of its citizens and the welfare of other people who are being persecuted in other locations. It's Medina Shel Chesed. Also, in terms of tolerance of religion. Outside of Israel, the amount of Torah that's studied in the United States is numbers which are since the temple period. There haven't been numbers this, let's say qualitatively, but quantitatively, that's it. You realize the United States merits tremendous bounty continuously, despite all the problems. God forbid, you see what goes on with terrorism in the world. Relatively speaking, I'm not saying we don't have acts of terrorism. We have undercover, you have a CIA and an FBI where they always nip it in the bud, don't allow these cells to bring about a terrorist attack. Even though we had 9/11, we had problems. But factually, most of them are prevented. There's what we call a divine protection over the United States. Why? You know why? Chesed ve'emes yichu parov, because acts of loving kindness on a legendary level exist here in the United States. In addition, the amount of Torah that's in the United States almost doesn't exist anywhere in the world. Therefore, that provides that divine protection for its citizenry, that we live basically safe compared to other locations in the world. Whether it's the car bombing, terrorist attacks, whatever, we don't have that here. We have issues, but nothing compared to that. At one time in the United States, Americans, they prided themselves in truth and honesty. They pride themselves, a product that's made in the United States is genuine. It is what they present it to be. There was a degree of honesty. I'm not saying they're dishonest people, but the persona of the fabric of America was truth. That's what it was. With all the criticism of the founding fathers of the United States, whatever it is, whether it's justified or not just, it doesn't make a difference. But the perspective was, we want to do better than the rest of the world. We want to take care of our citizens better. And eventually many things happened to better things. Do you have problems because people are not appreciative? That's people. That will never change. But again, the concept is Chesed ve'emes yichu parov. When God sees Chesed, God looks at the world differently. And it generates bounty. As he says, qualitatively, quantitatively, the more we do, the more he does. And that's basically where we're at, to be continued. Ask your question again, Larry.
Okay, so the question is, Rabbi, is one supposed to go out aggressively to seek to do acts of loving kindness, or do you merit credit? Do you get credit if an occasion comes your way and you respond accordingly and do an act of loving kindness?
Okay. No question. If an act of opportunity comes your way, you do it, of course. You're worthy. You did something great. But the two terminologies in Hebrew, there's one who does acts of kindness and a person who's classified as a person who is that That's his persona. Meaning, even if it doesn't come his way, he's looking for opportunities. Like a person is an investor, a savvy investor, he's looking for opportunities to invest his money. He understands because that's where he's going to get his return. One's called a Baal Chesed. Baal Chesed means this is your domain. Your domain is Chesed. A person's domain is Chesed. He's looking for opportunities to help people, to provide wherever he could. The other person he's happy to do acts of loving kindness, but he's not driven by it. If it comes his way and he values it, he'll do it. So one who does chesed, the other one is domain is chesed. Avraham Avinu, who's the founding father of the Jewish people, he's referred to as the pillar of loving kindness. When it was the hottest day of the year, and it was the third day of circumcision, and the wayfarers weren't on the road, he didn't have the opportunity to chesed. He was sitting at the entrance of his tent, looking in every direction. Where are the people to host, to do hospitality, needy people? Until finally God sends him 3 angels in human form, and he hosted them. Avraham Avinu, it's not only when he came upon the opportunity, he looked for the opportunity. I'll give you an example. This is the litmus test. Somebody comes to your door. You aren't looking for the person, because most situations you can't find that special situation. And when you see and you hear the story, it's not only you're agreeable to help them, you feel fortunate that you have the privilege to help this person, because it's something special what you're doing. You get excited about it, or I have an obligation, I'll help him. I got to live with my conscience, I'm going to help him. A person's truly, that's his domain. When that person comes to his door, not only does he want to help him, he feels privileged that he's able to be involved in making a difference in this person's life or in the cause that he's presenting to. That's the difference between the two people. I hear what you're saying. I'm happy to help. The other person feels privileged because this is his fare, so to say. Tell you a story. Certain person came from Israel to raise money for a certain area of Jewish education. Came from Bnei Brak. And he was a very special person. He was a nephew of the Chazon Ish. He was a Karelitz. He was a nephew of the Chazon Ish, who was the leading Torah sage in Israel. He passed away in the 50s, early 50s. And I called up a person who was a very substantial person. And it's not easy to get into this person's office. I send him there, and he's happy to meet him. And he gave him something very substantial. He calls me up after, he says, I want to tell you something. You have more of these kinds of people, just keep sending them to me. That's what he said to me. You understand? He's happy to do, but he doesn't want people to waste his time. If it's the real thing, send more. Meaning, he wants to. It's not, it comes his way, he'll do. If it's the real thing, it's authentic, act where he'll make a difference, he wants to make a difference. Not that he wants all the fanfare and the recognition. It's not no recognition. Nobody has to know that he didn't make a public knowledge, he helped this man. But he called me personally. If I have other people of this caliber, just keep sending them. That's not a person who does kindness. His domain is kindness, but he has to find the right thing to actually actualize that attribute of kindness.